secret of the embalmer. At first, I thought my job as an embalmer would be simple. Creepy, yes, but manageable. But one night, while I was alone at the funeral home, everything changed. I never expected that, in the stillness of the night, I would uncover a secret that would alter my understanding of life and death. For a while, I worked quietly, embalming bodies as if they were just lifeless objects. No movement, no feeling, just cold and stiff. But when Mang Isko, an old embalmer who had been working at the funeral home for almost 40 years, came around, I began noticing something strange. Every time a new body arrived, he would stay longer in the room, whispering something I couldn't quite hear. Sometimes I caught him muttering, "Don't let them wake." One night I was assigned to handle the embalming alone. Mang Isko had mysteriously disappeared from his shift, and I was the only one left at the funeral home. A new body had arrived, a young girl who had died in a car accident. As I opened the casket and prepared to start, I felt an unusual chill in the air. But what really made my skin crawl was when I saw her eyelids flutter. It couldn't be real, I told myself. Maybe it was just a trick of the light or my tired mind playing games with me. But when I looked again, it was clear. Her eyes opened slightly. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. This was impossible. I took a step back, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. As I stared in shock, the girl's mouth began to move, as though she was trying to speak, her lips forming silent words. Then I heard a faint, raspy whisper escape from her throat. "Help me!" I stumbled back, my hands shaking. The cold in the room intensified, and every instinct told me to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from her. Was she alive? How could this be happening? I reached for my phone to call someone, anyone, but the battery was dead. Panic surged through me. Suddenly, I remembered Mang Isko's words. "Don't let them wake." Was this what he had been warning me about? Was there something more to his rituals? Something darker? Before I could even process my next move, I heard a creak from behind me. The door to the embalming room slowly swung open on its own. I wasn't alone anymore. My heart raced as I turned toward the creaking door. The room felt colder with each passing second, the air thick and suffocating. I could barely hear my own breathing over the pounding in my ears. The embalming room door, now wide open, revealed nothing but darkness beyond. But I knew something, or someone was there. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Silence. Just the soft hum of the fluorescent lights above me, flickering ever so faintly. I turned back to the girl on the table, her eyes now fully open, wide with terror. Her lips were no longer moving, but the fear in her gaze was unmistakable. I couldn't move, trapped in a surreal nightmare. And then it hit me. She wasn't looking at me. Her eyes were fixed on something behind me. I swallowed hard, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I had to know. Slowly I turned around. Standing in the doorway was Mang Isko. But something was wrong. His face, pale and twisted, looked as if it had aged decades overnight. His eyes, usually sharp and calculating, were now vacant, hollow. His lips moved, but no sound came out. His hands, shaking, pointed toward the girl on the table. "Don't let them wake," he finally croaked, his voice hoarse, almost inhuman. Before I could respond, Mang Isko stepped forward, his movements stiff and unnatural. I backed away, stumbling into the embalming table. The girl's cold hand brushed against mine, making me jerk in terror. I turned to her, and to my horror, her lips moved again. "Please, don't let him finish." I was caught between them, the room closing in, the air thick with the scent of chemicals and death. The lights flickered violently now, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. Mang Isko's figure loomed closer, his eyes now locked on mine. Without warning, he lunged at the girl, grabbing her wrist with a strength that seemed impossible for someone his age. "It's too late," he growled, his voice echoing unnaturally through the room. The girl let out a blood-curdling scream, her eyes rolling back as her body convulsed violently. I tried to intervene, but an invisible force seemed to pin me to the spot. The entire room shook, the lights flickering faster, plunging us into darkness every few seconds. And then, everything stopped. The silence was deafening. The lights steadied, and Mang Isko stood motionless over the girl's lifeless body. His breathing was shallow, and for a brief moment, I thought it was over. But then he turned to me, his eyes now black as coal. "You shouldn't have stayed," he hissed. The lights went out completely. The darkness swallowed me whole. I couldn't see a thing, and the cold was now unbearable. My breath came in shallow gasps, the weight of fear pressing down on my chest. I fumbled in the dark, trying to find my bearings, but all I could hear was the sound of heavy breathing. Too close, too real. "Mang Isko," I whispered, though I already knew the answer. That thing I saw earlier wasn't him. Not anymore. Suddenly I felt something brush against my shoulder, cold and rough. I jumped back, my heart slamming in my chest, but I couldn't run. I was trapped in the pitch-black room, the only escape blocked by whatever Mang Isko had become. Out of nowhere, a dim light flickered, barely illuminating the embalming table. The girl's body was gone. I stared in disbelief, the table empty except for the stained sheet where she had been moments before. Panic surged through me. Where had she gone? A faint whisper filled the room, coming from every direction at once. "You let her wake!" I spun around, desperate to find the source. The whisper turned into a soft giggle, like a child playing hide and seek. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I stumbled toward the door, but it slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. Then from the corner of the room, the girl emerged. She stood there, her pale, lifeless form swaying slightly. Her eyes were wide, hollow pits, her skin unnaturally stretched over her bones. She smiled, but it wasn't a smile of innocence. It was something twisted, something wrong. Her lips parted, and a low, guttural growl escaped her throat. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. She moved toward me slow and deliberate, her bare feet dragging across the cold tile floor, leaving bloody smudges in her wake. Behind her, Mang Isko's silhouette appeared in the shadows, his black eyes glowing faintly. "You should have listened," he rasped. "They're not meant to come back." The girl lunged at me with a speed I didn't think possible, her cold hands wrapping around my wrist. Her grip was iron, her nails digging into my skin as she pulled me toward the embalming table. I screamed, trying to wrench myself free, but her strength was beyond anything human. My body felt paralyzed, the overwhelming terror making it impossible to fight back. Suddenly, her face was inches from mine, her breath cold and rancid. "Join us," she whispered, her voice echoing inside my skull. Before I could respond, the lights flickered violently again, and I caught a glimpse of Mang Isko standing beside me, holding a scalpel. His eyes were blank, his expression emotionless. "This is what happens," he muttered, raising the scalpel toward my throat, "when you disturb the dead." I struggled against the girl's grip, but the more I fought, the tighter she held me. The room began to spin, the air thickening as the whispers turned into wails, filling the space with deafening screams of torment. And then, everything stopped. I woke up on the cold floor, drenched in sweat. The room was silent, and Mang Isko and the girl were gone. The embalming table was empty, the door to the room slightly ajar. But I knew better. This wasn't over. The silence was suffocating. I lay on the cold floor, trembling, the faint echo of those terrifying whispers still ringing in my ears. My head throbbed, but the dull ache was nothing compared to the gnawing fear crawling up my spine. The embalming room door was open just a crack, casting a sliver of dim light across the floor. I forced myself to my feet, every muscle aching, and staggered toward the door, desperate to escape whatever horror still lingered in this cursed place. I barely touched the handle when I heard it. The faint sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from behind me. I froze. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Turning around was the hardest thing I'd ever done. In the shadowy corner of the room, where the embalming table once stood, I saw it, the girl. But this time she wasn't alone. A figure emerged from the darkness, Mang Isko, only it wasn't him anymore. His body was twisted and contorted, his limbs bending at unnatural angles, as if something had broken and reassembled him. His once sharp eyes were nothing but black, empty voids, and his mouth hung open in a silent scream. Behind him, more figures began to appear, bodies all mangled and rotten. their empty eyes fixed on me. They were the dead. The girl's lips curled into a sickening grin as she spoke, her voice no longer a whisper, but a rasp that filled the room. "You let us wake!" I stumbled backward, slamming into the door. It was locked. How was that possible? I had just seen it open. My shaking hands fumbled for the light switch, but the moment I flipped it on, the bulbs burst, plunging the room into complete darkness. And then, the cold came. I felt it before I saw it, an overwhelming, bone-chilling cold that crept through my skin, freezing me in place. I could barely breathe as icy fingers wrapped around my throat. I thrashed against the invisible grip, but it was useless. They were all around me now, the dead closing in, whispering in unison. "Join us!" The cold tightened its grip, squeezing the air from my lungs, dragging me down to the floor. My vision blurred, but in the dim light I could make out their faces, twisted, decayed, and full of malice. Mang Isko stood above me, his lips moving as if in a chant, while the girl knelt beside me, her hand hovering over my chest. I could feel something, a force pressing down on my heart, like it was being crushed from the inside. "This is the price," Mang Isko said in a low guttural tone, his face inches from mine. "The dead are never meant to wake." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My body was growing numb, the life being drained from me, when suddenly the door behind me slammed open. A gust of wind rushed in, scattering the darkness. I gasped for air, the icy grip releasing me just as quickly as it had taken hold. My chest burned with each ragged breath as I crawled toward the open door, my vision swimming. I didn't look back, couldn't. I just knew that if I did, I would never leave this place alive. I stumbled into the hallway, the flickering lights above casting eerie shadows along the walls. But it wasn't over, not yet. I could hear them, whispers, footsteps, closing in from every direction. I wasn't alone anymore, and they were coming for me. I ran through the narrow hallway, my legs barely carrying me, the whispers of the dead echoing in every corner. Their cold breath was on my neck, their fingers almost grazing my skin. I didn't know where I was going, I just needed to escape. But deep down, I knew there was no escape from them. I reached the front door of the funeral home, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. My hands fumbled with the lock, and just as I felt the cold fingers of the dead closing in, the door swung open. I stumbled outside into the night, gasping for air, my body drenched in sweat. The night was eerily silent. The funeral home behind me stood dark and lifeless, as if none of what I had just experienced had happened. But I knew better. I knew they were still inside, waiting. I turned back one last time. In the window, I saw her, the girl. Her lifeless eyes stared at me, her lips curled in that same sickening smile. And beside her, Mang Isko, his hollow gaze piercing through the darkness. I ran and never looked back. I never returned to the funeral home, never spoke of what happened that night. But sometimes in the dead of night, I hear them, the whispers, and I know that one day they will come for me. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more spine-chilling horror stories. See you next time, and remember to keep the lights on. You never know what might be lurking in the dark.